So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the MFA's virtual Juneteenth celebration. My name is Millar Fisher, and I am the Ronald C and Anita L Wornick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I'm here to help commemorate Juneteenth with a virtual spotlight. And I'm going to talk about an amazing and super powerful work called Law and Order, the Reincarnation of Frederick Douglass. And I'm talking about it with the artist himself, Roberto Lugo. Roberto, it's so lovely to be here with you today. Thank you for taking the time to do the spotlight talk with us. We are incredibly proud to have one of your works, this work, in the MFA's collection. And it's actually on view just now in the galleries, but we can't get to see it in person because the galleries are shut just now. So it's great that we can talk about it today for the Juneteenth commemoration. But first, before we start, I just wanted to ask how things are with you. I know that you were currently meant to be in Italy right now. You were the recipient of the super prestigious Rome Prize. And so where are you zooming in from just now, and how have things been?
I'm zooming in from Airbnb in Philadelphia. So we didn't know that a pandemic was happening. So when we knew we were going to be away for 6 months, we decided to sell our house because we wanted to move to a different neighborhood anyway. We figured we'd have 6 months. So we went from that home, and we've been in now 4 different Airbnbs with 2 kids. So it's been quite a lot. But you know, it has given me a lot of family time that I don't normally have, and a bit of perspective, I think, on the importance of slowing down.
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly important to think about in general at this point in time. There's always a rush to produce. So I'm really interested to see what happens when artists have, you know, maybe not a chosen moment, but what art can come out of a moment in time where it asks us to think differently about the ways in which we engage with the wheel of production and the wheel of making. I'm going to share my screen just now because I want to share one of the images that we have of your really amazing work. And I've put you in the picture, Roberto, for scale. So this is the work that we have in the MFA's collection, Law and Order, the Reincarnation of Frederick Douglass. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you came to make this particular work and how it fits in with the rest of the works that you make.
Sure. So I did a artist residency in Hungary some years ago, maybe 2013, at a place called the International Ceramic Studio. And at the International Ceramic Studio, you're able to use this beautiful porcelain called Heron Porcelain from Heron Porcelain, the manufacturer. So during that residency, I got to visit the factory in Hungary. And, you know, there's hundreds of workers there, and all of them are just such talented people, and they have such a high sense of craft. I mean, everything there is high painted, and it all has to look, you know, the way that they originally designed. And in the back room, there was this room where they kept a small group of people aside, and those were known as the master china painters. And they were painting these large faceted jars. And we got a bit into the conversation about, you know, who normally buys these things and how they're such sought after objects. And, you know, these objects have often been made for, you know, royalty, you know, around the world, different sort of types of royalty. And I said to myself, you know, what it would be like if I were to be able to bring back that form and make that, and then be able to get to choose who goes on there, and not sort of being this commission to put a portrait of someone who's wealthy on it, but getting to decide. And then the scale of it itself would allow me to have, be able to think through narrative. So on most of my work, I'll generally have these 2 vignettes, and I'll feature portraits of people that I wish to pay homage to. And this idea came from not seeing enough people of color working as craft artisans, and, you know, receiving acknowledgement for their work. But then also the people that have been featured on not just ceramics, but really just visual arts as a whole have been not necessarily my my idea of who I would put on those. And so as an artist, I have an autonomy to do that. And so this particular piece came from a combination of things. It came from, I've been working with a lot of historic figures that were abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. And there was this interview with Donald Trump where he spoke about him as if he was in the present tense. Mm-hmm. And so that's the idea of the reincarnation of Frederick Douglass currently existing. And me thinking about living in a world where, for me, Frederick Douglass is, you know, like a famous, I don't know, like a president or someone that, you know, it's easily recognizable in my community and culture. And so is Trayvon Martin, and so is Mike Brown, and these faces, and thinking about how, you know, even the most famous person in my world is foreign to someone like a Donald Trump, and to a large part of America who doesn't know his contributions. And so that intertwined with the idea that, you know, at the time he'd also mentioned, they asked him about, you know, the stop and frisk laws, and he mentioned his response to it was that we need law and order, and he just kept repeating law and order. And I just thought of what that meant to others in keeping people of color in line in how we do that. And it's through positions of power, the president and politicians obviously being in positions of power, but also police being in position of power. So just to clarify with this piece, I'm not saying that every politician is a racist, and I'm not saying that every cop is a bad person, but those are positions that basically you have the autonomy a lot of times to take somebody's life through your actions. And so in this piece, there's actually a paddy wagon that's also a conveyor belt of people going in and not coming out alive.
Yeah, and we can look at a detail, make sure that we have a detail of that folks can see on the screen when they come to see this particular conversation. I guess one of the questions that I have for you, Roberto, and it's one that like often comes to mind when I'm looking at your work, and it's particularly actually strongly in my mind just now when we're in the aftermath of the story of Christian Cooper, who was stopped in Central Park because he was a Black man wild birding, or of George Floyd, who very recently was killed by the police as an act of police brutality. When you are thinking about including figures whose narratives are incredibly powerful, but also incredible reminders of the presence of white supremacy in our everyday lives, how does that come to affect you as an artist? Not even just as a person, but as an artist too, because they are both powerful histories to tell, but also really deep emotional places to go, I think, as an artist. Like, how do you keep a sense of hope or just general well-being?
Yeah, well, I mean, it can be really taxing. And I think a lot of times it derives from a very organic fear of my own life, and the fear that I grew up around, like fearing police and not trusting, you know, people in positions of authority. And so, you know, in making these works, I try to think about not necessarily the function of pottery as a tool to eat and drink from. I am a fan of that, and I do some of that too, but I'm thinking more about the function of it as a sort of ethnographic or maybe anthropologic sort of like tool to talk a little bit about our culture today, which has historically been something that ceramics is known for. I mean, in a lot of anthropology museums, you'll see ceramic objects. And so I think about the longevity of these objects and the permanence of them and how they can last thousands of years. And then I think about some of these, you know, like the folks you just mentioned, you know, they're this month's, you know, people. I mean, unfortunately, it's going to happen again, right? And so how do I keep the conversation and these lives alive? And so for me, you know, I didn't make a pot with Trayvon Martin or Mike Brown right after they died. I waited for years later, you know, or sometime later, so that way it wasn't like the number one thing on the news. And so this face, you're having to interact with it and face it. And in some ways, I think like that's my way of treating pottery as a functional object, functioning as like a memorial for these lives that were lost.
So for anyone who's just joining us, I'm here with artist Roberto Lugo talking about his work that we see here on the screen, Law and Order, the Reincarnation of Frederick Douglass. And we're doing it as part of the MFA's Juneteenth celebrations as a spotlight talk. I want to go a little bit further into the details here, Roberto, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here. It's a portrait of Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved person who became a very outspoken, very important abolitionist in the late 19th century, and actually ended up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, so has a connection to the state that this work is now in. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the choices that you've made in terms of decoration on the vessel that we can see here, and also that we'll see in a few other details. There's homage to things like graffiti, for example. There's homage to very traditional decorative aspects of China and pottery. There's homage to transferware as well. So you're someone who knows these histories. How are you instrumentalizing them here?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a combination of the trying to figure out how to communicate with a broad audience. Like, I'm not just necessarily trying to speak to other people of color. I'm trying to be able to communicate with people from all different places. And one of the ways that I think of doing that is by looking at and thinking of objects that are familiar to us, forms of decoration that are familiar with us. When we think of blue and white, for example, on a shiny object, you know, you can associate that with pottery. And these very familiar forms of decoration, and what I'm trying to do is figure out how to represent the community and culture that I grew up in and that I live in, next to these very familiar forms for people that are not familiar with it. And so the way that it often works is people that come from where I come from aren't necessarily familiar with blue and white pottery or pottery in general, but they see someone recognizable in it. And so they find themselves in the work interacting with it in a different way or interpreting in a different way than someone who is familiar with the blue and white ornamentation or the decoration on the very bottom third of the pot is something that was inspired from my trip to Heron Porcelain. And then they're not familiar with the face and they're not familiar with the graffiti. And then it starts to build this question of why are all these things here? And so what I wanted to do was take all these different patterns and forms of decoration and intertwine them in a way that I felt was organic to the form. You know, it's like you can see here Mike Brown and some traditional motifs, but then also there's this kind of like Basquiat crown in there. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the reasons why I use a Basquiat crown is because for years I grew up doing graffiti and we'd always sign it with a crown, but I never knew who Basquiat was until I got to college. So it's a really interesting for me to have come upon that, because it was this realization that there was so much about art and culture that it affected my life in a way that I wasn't privy to, that I didn't know about. Like, how do I grow up doing graffiti in Philadelphia and never know about Jean-Michel Basquiat, who is half Puerto Rican and half Haitian, I believe. And so it just goes to show that the education that I've received. And so what I'm trying to do here is really try to figure out how to synthesize this sort of like high and low, and be able to bring into this conversation where, you know, there isn't a low, like you know, graffiti can, you know, hold its weight next to this other form of sort of high-end decoration.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually, you perfectly set me up for the next question that I want to ask. So I'm going to go back, actually, the PowerPoint is going to give me, I hope, an image of you on the sidewalk in Kensington in Philadelphia, very close to where you grew up. And so if it'll go to the correct image that I have, there we go, fantastic. So one of the things that, amongst the many things that I really love about your work, Roberto, it's been an education for me. As you can probably tell by my accent, as you know, because we know each other, I'm not from the US, I came from Scotland. So when I came here 15 years ago, I didn't know anything really about US history. It wasn't taught where I went to school. And so it's been a process of looking and learning and reading and listening. And your work has definitely been an education for me in terms of understanding histories that I otherwise might not have come across. And I'm really interested in your work as an artist, but also as an educator. You are one of the most passionate people I know in terms of making sure that folks who might be interested, folks who might not necessarily have come across the medium of clay, get to connect with it. You're a professor at Tyler, but you're also very much enmeshed in thinking about how to bring many different communities into contact with clay, with ceramics, with pottery, with those histories. Can you talk a little bit about your work doing that and what we're looking at here maybe on the screen?
Sure. So this is part of an effort, the Clay Studio, which is really an organization that's close to my heart and that I'm on the board of. In Philadelphia is moving actually to Kensington, to my old neighborhood. And we were brainstorming on ways to figure out how to interact with the community and do it in a way that wasn't imposing on the community anything different than, you know, its own identity and culture. And so one of the things I thought of is, you know, growing up, my father would sell a lot of products on the street, not drugs, but like comforters and you know, posters and whatever he could get his hands on, he would sell in the street. And I thought of how many people he interacted with, and I said, well, if I can just set up a potter's wheel on a street and just start throwing, I just want to see what happens. Like, get into conversations with people. Maybe some people will want to learn how to make pottery. And one of the ideas is, you know, like, I feel like I was very fortunate to fall into art and to wind up taking an art class and getting into ceramics. My perspective isn't that like I'll somehow make dozens of potters through teaching on the street, but it's more about, if you expose enough people to something, then the people that are supposed to be potters will eventually find it. The people that are supposed to be athletes will find that. And I find that not enough people of color are exposed to clay. And I think part of the reason why is because there's a large expense to it. You need equipment, you need facilities. And for places that are struggling to even have art programs, it's just, you know, an absolute no. And so for these neighborhoods, this is probably the only time somebody will see someone throw pottery directly in their life. And what was amazing was, you know, when I was first setting up, people, you know, were very freaked out by me being there. And, you know, there was people that were in the corner and it looked like they were, I mean, from my experience that I actually lived there, they looked like they were selling drugs. And, you know, maybe 30 minutes into throwing pottery, like some of those same guys came over and I gave them pottery lessons, and they were the same people giving me crap a minute ago about doing it. And then there was like sex workers who came and wanted to learn how to make pottery, and just people around the neighborhood. And what was interesting is it diminished this barrier, this wall of them not being able to have access to these things because of money, or because of their circumstances. And so I'm really interested in that idea of bringing in diverse audiences, whether it's to the museum to see work that's already finished, to make work and to be in a conversation about our culture and society. And so it just feels like it's moving in the right direction. I don't exactly know where it's gonna go, but I can't worry about that. I just sort of like set up my wheel now and you know, see what happens from it.
And that brings me to the last question that I have for you, Roberto. It was the poster that I was so excited to find when I came to the Tyler Open Studios last fall. And we can see it here on the screen by, I think, was both Layla and Jacob your students, or was it just Layla who was your student? But this came out of a conversation that you'd had about how people access learning and teaching and using clay, right?
Yeah, so Layla was a graduate student, just graduated. Unfortunately, they weren't able to be in studio the last few months. And Jacob is her partner. And Layla was really interested in how most how-to posters are done with white hands, and how it's you know, this is very much a how-to poster, but it's, I think one of the things is just having a person of color throwing, I think you know, for some, they might not even notice it, which is kind of the point, right? Is to like integrate people of all different backgrounds to be able to do whatever it is that they want to do. And so if we want to see that, then, you know, it's up to us to be able to bring those things to the world. And so I was really proud of Layla for doing this, and, you know, seeing things in the world, seeing issues and concerns in the world, and then taking action to be able to do something about it. And one of the things that's really wonderful is she made these posters. We did a bit of fundraising to raise the money, and then they were distributed for free. And so these are actually all over the country in different pottery studios. And the idea is this notion of integration. I mean, if someone is shocked by this image, it's probably because, you know, they don't think people of color should be making pottery, which is a different conversation, I think.
Yeah, it's a beautiful and subtle work. And if we were in the MFA right now, you'd see that these posters are right next to your law and order vessel, and that they get taken at a really rapid rate. So we have to keep like making sure the stack is piled up. But I'm really proud to have this work there, because I think it just articulates the things that are right at the heart of your practice. It's about accessibility, about representation, about the politics of everyday making. I think so often for me, as someone who works within craft and design as a curator, I'm struck by how often craft is maybe reduced to a set of materials or a set of technical practices. And for me, and I think you, and for the craft makers that really make my heart sing, craft is an ethos, it's a way of being in the everyday. And I think your work and this poster really articulates that for folks who come into the gallery. I'm so sorry that they can't see your work in person, but I know that they're going to see it very soon when the galleries open up again. And for now, I'm just incredibly grateful that you took the time to do this Juneteenth spotlight with us, Roberto. It was incredibly kind of you. And I hope people stay tuned, because the next thing that we have is going to be hosted for Juneteenth by our MFA teams. Thanks so much.
Thank you.